According to St. Matthew, the 5th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you, when people revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You know, to be honest, I get a kind of funny feeling every time I read these Beatitudes, these opening words of today's Gospel reading. On the one hand, they make me feel kind of warm and fuzzy, because Jesus talks about all of these unlikely people who end up being blessed by God. And I think that's nice, and I feel warm and fuzzy, and I keep feeling that way until I think harder about this. And then I start to realize that when I think some more, these kinds of situations that Jesus is speaking about are not normally the times that I feel particularly blessed by God. If you were going to ask me about the times that I felt blessed by God, I probably would not tell you about the times that I was poor, in body or in spirit. I do not feel particularly blessed by God at those moments. I do not feel particularly blessed by God and warm and fuzzy when I am mourning. I do not feel particularly blessed by God when I am in situations where I'm being picked on or persecuted. Those are not the moments that I feel blessed. So I'm tempted, as I think this, to say to Jesus, "You know, Lord, if these are the kind of situations I need to be in to be blessed, where can I go to sign up not to be blessed? Because I don't feel usually very blessed in those kinds of situations. I suspect that most of you don't either." So, what is it that Jesus is talking about in these Beatitudes? What is he telling us with these things? Now, to begin with, it's important to know that these Beatitudes are not Jesus advocating some kind of Christian masochism for disciples, like we should go out and seek to be people who are being persecuted and beaten up, people who are poor and miserable just for its own sake. Otherwise, Jesus wouldn't tell us that God has something more in mind for us. These words of Jesus are not helpful advice for you to give to friends who are in a situation of pain and mourning. You know, people who go up to maybe you when you've been in a situation and say, "Don't worry, this is really a blessing in disguise. God has a plan for you to be suffering like this." This is not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not even giving us the option of saying, "Hey, if I choose not to be blessed, will I be able to get out of all of these situations of mourning and weakness and persecution and this feeling that righteousness is never going to happen in my life?" That's not what Jesus is saying. And that last part is actually, I think, the beginning of understanding what Jesus is saying with these Beatitudes. Because Jesus has come into a world that is already full of suffering and mourning and conflict. His disciples experience it already, and so does everybody else. And like the others, Jesus' disciples probably already know that they're going to have to continue to face suffering and pain and difficulty in life. The question is, Will they actually enter into those situations when they don't have to? That is, will they see a blessing in standing with those who mourn? Will they see a blessing in entering into a situation of conflict in order to help make peace? Will they see a blessing in working for justice and righteousness when it just doesn't seem that their work is making any progress? See, Jesus' pronouncement of blessing in the hardest, darkest situations of life is the pronouncement that God notices, that God cares, and that God is seeking to be present, acting to heal and help and restore, even in those situations that to us seem the most hopeless. So will the disciples of Jesus see the places that God wants to be? And will they be open to entering into those situations to be the vehicle of God's blessing? Now, to be honest again, I don't like doing that. It's a hard thing. I have in my life, and you probably do too, plenty of times when you have to experience mourning and weakness and persecution and being picked on. So when you have the option of saying, do I want to enter into another one of those situations with somebody else and stand there with them, sometimes the gut reaction is, no, I want to back out of this. And partly that's because I think to myself when I'm in those kind of situations, I have no idea what I would do to fix that situation, to make that situation better. What do I say? What do I do? How do I act? Sometimes I don't got a clue. But sometimes those are the very moments that Jesus is calling us to live the Beatitudes. And while I know this intellectually, and I suspect probably all of you do too, I remember about 4 years ago I was doing the wedding of a person who had been a kid in my first congregation. I had known her since she was 6, 7 years old. And when she got ready to get married, she called me up and said, would you participate in this wedding? And I said, okay, sure, I will go ahead and do that. So I came and participated in the wedding, and afterwards we all went to the reception, and I saw people that I had not seen for years there, including a lot of people that I recognized. But as the reception started up, all of a sudden, one of the bridesmaids that I did not remember or didn't think that I knew, came up, running up to me, threw her arms around me, hugged me, and said, "Hi, Pastor Steve, do you remember me?" And I said, I'm thinking, how is it that I should remember this woman? And she, before I could say anything, she started to tell me the story of why I should remember her. And in that moment, this event from about 13 years before came flooding back to me. An event that probably I had blocked from my memory. Because I usually like to illustrate sermons with kind of funny, interesting stories. This is really a very tragic story. Turns out that the bridesmaid and the bride were cousins. And they had had another cousin, and they were all 11, 12, 13 years old at this point. And one day, the mom of the bride called me up at the church, and she said, well, I'd like to take the girls, and I'd like to come over to church and have all of us sit and talk for a little bit. Because this other cousin that they were very close to was having a conflict with his parents, and they were fighting. And the cousin decided that he was going to show his parents and get back at them by pretending that he was going to fake killing himself. And unfortunately, as happens in some of those situations, he managed, probably accidentally, to actually succeed in killing himself. And the girls had just found out about this, and they were a mess, as you might imagine. And Mom says, can we all come over and sit and talk to you? And I said, of course, come on over. And I hung up the phone, and we've had pastors get training in doing some of these things. But in spite of that, in that moment, I thought, I have no idea what I'm going to do, what I'm going to say. They came over, and I remember as the bridesmaid told me the story, we all sat there. I remember sitting there for about an hour and having this conversation and talking to them, and all I can remember about what I said and what I did, so that you have the experience of all of my brains, and if you're ever in a situation like this, is I remember that whole hour, everything I said and thought was in my brain just, I don't know what it was I said or did. And the mom told me afterwards, she said, that was really helpful. I really appreciate you doing that. That really helped get them through this situation. And I didn't think a whole lot more about it until 13 years later, when the bridesmaid comes running up to me and says essentially, you know, I remember you because you were there entering into that horrible, unspeakable situation at that moment in my life, and you were God's presence then, when I needed it. And that was one of the really kind of vivid reminders in my life that what Jesus is really calling us to do a lot of the time, to live as his disciples, to live in a kind of righteousness, is not to walk around and act holy and pious. But sometimes it's simply a matter of showing up in those horrible situations and being open to being the vehicle and the presence of God in somebody else's life. That in and of itself is the first part, and sometimes that's hard because I remember hanging up the phone and thinking, I got to go do this now, and it's really important, but deep down in my gut, I felt like crawling in a hole someplace and going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But you know, there's an awful lot of people who in times of pain and suffering will say, so where is God in this situation? What Jesus calls us to do as his disciples is sometimes just to show up so that we can be the presence of God in somebody else's life, so that we can be the vehicles through whom God acts. And it doesn't mean that you got all the answers and you're all prepared for it and you know all these things, because the second part of that, of living those Beatitudes, is being willing to embrace the weakness, to embrace the places where I don't feel like I'm strong and I'm ready and I've got all the answers. And in fact, sometimes that has a benefit. And I say this as the person who always wants to be planned, have everything planned out and be set, know all this kind of stuff. But you know, Paul in today's second reading makes a big deal about how important human weakness is for God's plan. And what he means by that is simply the fact that sometimes when I think I got it all figured out, and I know what to say and what to do and how it's all going to work, I'm tempted to sort of say to God, you know, God, I can handle this one. Don't worry about it. I got it all figured out. And when I don't, I get out of the way, and then God can work through me. God can do things, because even, you know, like I say, looking back on this situation, all I can remember saying was, I'm sure I didn't, but it wasn't because I was so strong and had it all figured out. Sometimes that's the most important thing for us to do, to live these Beatitudes. And for us too. Living the Beatitudes, living in this new kind of righteousness that Jesus calls us to live in, is really about simply opening ourselves up to the fact that God is going to work in our lives in places and in situations and in times that we do not expect. Because I don't know about you, but I'm always looking to experience the blessing of God, the presence of God, when it's light and sunny, and the birds are singing in the air, and I'm reading the Bible, and I'm listening to inspirational music. That's where I want to see the presence of God. But a lot of the time, God shows up at the cross, in the ugliness, the messiness, the pain of life, and that's where God's present. Sometimes living in this new kind of righteousness that Jesus calls us to live in is about accepting that and looking for God in those places. Because God shows up in moments that we do not expect, and often in situations that people think must be completely devoid of the presence and the power of God. It is an idea that just turns everything we usually think about God on its head. And in fact, as we continue to read through Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, you're going to find that Jesus does that a lot. He's constantly turning things that we think about God on their heads. And as he does that, he calls us to live in this new kind of righteousness, a righteousness that is not expressed in some kind of pious religiosity, but rather is expressed in living the Beatitudes. Living the Beatitudes in such a way that we see God in places where others probably don't expect God to be. It's about being willing to enter into those places, even the difficult and painful places, in order to be the light and the salt that God works through to bring about light and blessing. And it's even about accepting our own weaknesses in those situations, so that the power of God can really get a hold of us and work in us and through us to bring a blessing in the lives of others.